Hello everyone, welcome to the Tim Booker channel. I wish you all a pleasant listening experience. Today, I'd like to introduce you to a book called Emotional Blackmail. This is a best-selling psychology book that has been popular worldwide for 20 years. Many people may not realize that they might be experiencing emotional blackmail in their interpersonal relationships. Emotional blackmail is a form of psychological manipulation that can occur between family members, partners, friends, or co-workers, and it can be quite insidious. For example, your significant other might say, "If you really love me, you should do what I say." Your parents might say, "I've done so much for you, why can't you be obedient?" Your friends might say, "We've known each other for so many years, why can't you help me out?" The underlying message in all these statements is that if you love or care about someone, you should comply with their wishes. You find yourself giving in repeatedly, and it becomes emotionally exhausting. This is when you need to be cautious about being emotionally blackmailed. The author of this book, Dr. Susan Forward, is a renowned American psychologist and best-selling author with over 20 years of experience in psychotherapy, helping many people overcome emotional challenges. The book we're discussing today once reached the #1 spot on the New York Times bestseller list, had 8 reprints, and was translated into 20 languages. In this book, Susan uses vivid real-life examples to reveal how emotional blackmail works and provides guidance on how to break free from it. I will explain this book in 3 parts. First, what is emotional blackmail and how does it work? Second, why do people fall into emotional blackmail? And third, how should one respond to emotional blackmail? Alright, let's now discuss the first part, what is emotional blackmail, and how does it work? In simple terms, emotional blackmail is a powerful manipulation technique. When conflicts arise among close individuals, one party exploits the vulnerabilities and fears of the other, using threats to make them comply with their desires. If the other party refuses to comply, they face consequences. In reality, different types of blackmailers exhibit different behavior patterns and employ various methods of emotional blackmail. The book categorizes them into 4 types: perpetrators, self-punishers, guilt-trippers, and bribers. Perpetrators are the most easily noticeable because they reveal their manipulation tactics overtly or through silent treatment when their demands are not met. Self-punishers don't lash out at you, instead, they harm themselves. When faced with rejection, they may warn the other person that if they don't comply, they won't be able to go on. Guilt-trippers, on the other hand, don't threaten to harm others but constantly imply that all the suffering they endure is the other person's fault. They may seem fragile on the surface but are, in fact, silent tyrants who exploit guilt to force concessions. Bribers, the 4th type, are the most discreet of the 4. They often make enticing promises and then threaten to withdraw them during the fulfillment process. Their promises might not be material but can be emotional, like an intimate relationship or a loving and supportive family. However, these dreams come at the cost of strict compliance with the briber's demands. After discussing the types of blackmailers, let's talk about the common tactics they employ. Blackmailers primarily use 4 methods to pressure their victims, break their psychological defenses, and ultimately make them yield. 1. Moral high ground. They position themselves as the morally superior party, painting the victim as the wrongdoer. 2. Pathologizing. They suggest that if you don't follow their advice or do as they say, you must have a problem, making the victim question their own sanity. 3. Coalition. Sometimes, blackmailers gather allies to pressure the victim. For instance, if a wife wants a divorce but her husband disagrees, he might enlist family and friends to convince her to change her mind. 4. Negative comparisons. They often say things like, "Look at others," to make the victim feel inadequate. It's important to note that blackmailers can exhibit multiple types and use various methods, as long as it serves their purpose. This concludes the content of the first part. Emotional blackmail is indeed a manipulative technique, and we've introduced the 4 types of emotional blackmailers along with their common tactics. Keep in mind that these types and methods are not fixed. Blackmailers may combine them to achieve their goals. Having discussed what emotional blackmail is, let's move on to the second part, why people fall into emotional blackmail. According to the author of this book, Susan, emotional blackmail is not a solo act but a duet. From the moment a blackmailer presents their demands to the point where the victim yields, it's a result of cooperation between the blackmailer and the victim. To deal with emotional blackmail correctly, one must have a clear understanding of each role in emotional blackmail. Let's begin with the blackmailer. Regardless of their type or tactics, at their core, all blackmailers use threats to apply pressure and gain control over the victim, making them act according to their wishes. The reason they do this lies in their deep-seated fear of loss. They fear losing and desperately seek perpetual support, even if it means sacrificing others. This fear primarily stems from complex upbringing environments. Some blackmailers grew up overly indulged, encountering few hardships in life, making them unable to handle rejection in adulthood. Conversely, some people experienced frequent demands but rarely had them met while growing up in an environment lacking love and support. Due to their lack of security, they are highly sensitive to setbacks. In either case, to alleviate their inner anxiety, fear, and insecurity, blackmailers turn to pressuring the victim, forcing them to compromise. Therefore, in emotional blackmail, it's not that the victim has done something wrong, it's the blackmailer satisfying their psychological needs. The benefits for the blackmailer are evident, but why do some people willingly become victims of emotional blackmail? Let's discuss the psychological state of the victim. The author likens emotional blackmail to a fog because when people encounter emotional blackmail, they get stuck in an emotional quagmire, lose their judgment, and make decisions that go against their inner values. The effectiveness of emotional blackmail is closely tied to the victim's psychological state. Many might wonder why intelligent and composed individuals can become victims of emotional blackmail and occasionally appear so fragile. What kind of people are more susceptible to becoming emotional blackmail victims? The key lies in emotional buttons. Emotional buttons, in this context, refer to the most vulnerable parts of a person's inner self, like a locked box storing uncomfortable emotions. The book primarily mentions three types of emotional buttons: fear, guilt, and shame. Fear involves the fear of abandonment, rejection, or losing love and support, such as not receiving a parent's love or losing a friend's support. Guilt relates to the responsibility adults feel for those close to them. If they fail to fulfill this responsibility, guilt creeps in. Shame arises from being a conscientious person and feeling guilty when violating personal or societal ethical norms. These emotional buttons aren't innate, they are shaped by our upbringing, childhood experiences, and education. For example, those who weren't well cared for by their parents during childhood often harbor stronger fears. If parents frequently demanded self-sacrifice from their children, they are likely to grow up assuming responsibilities that aren't theirs. Normally, these emotional buttons remain untouched, and people may not even be aware of their existence. However, once triggered, they bring back memories of negative emotions, clouding judgment and leading to compromises. Blackmailers exploit this to manipulate the victim. Often, the victim's compliance is to avoid conflict and gain temporary relief, believing it will maintain their relationship. However, the opposite is true, the victim's compliance rewards the blackmailer's behavior. Initially, the blackmailer tests the waters with minor requests, and if successful, they escalate to more significant issues, using the same tactics. Having discussed why people fall into emotional blackmail, let's move on to the third part, which is how to deal with emotional blackmail. To break free from emotional blackmail, two key elements come into play: changing automated response patterns and breaking free from emotional control. First, let's discuss how to change automated response patterns, which involves two steps: preparation and the SOS strategy. Before considering how to interact with the blackmailer, victims must engage in some preparation work to strengthen their belief in breaking free from emotional blackmail through positive psychological suggestions. Here are three methods. 1. Create a sense of ceremony, such as signing a contract with oneself, committing not to let fear, responsibility, and guilt influence their decisions. 2. Repeatedly say, "I can endure it." For instance, I can endure others' anger, I can endure others' manipulation, I can endure others' lack of understanding. This practice implants a positive message in the subconscious. 3. Replace old beliefs with new ones. For example, instead of thinking, "They're angry, so my request must be wrong," try transforming it into a new statement like, "Even though they're angry, my request is valid." Repeating these new statements aloud helps the mind accept these new beliefs. While practicing these exercises, you can imagine facing the emotional blackmailer and their intense pressure, but try to boost your confidence during these moments. Once the preparation work is done, the next step is to change automated response patterns, which involves the practical application of the SOS strategy outlined by the author. The SOS strategy consists of 3 steps. 1. Stop, this is the first step, which means to pause and stop. 2. Observe, in this step, one needs to calmly observe the situation. 3. Strategy, the third step is to formulate a strategy. Let's illustrate how a wife who has just given birth and desires to return to her career but faces emotional blackmail from her husband can use the SOS three-step approach to defuse the situation. Firstly, she should stop, giving herself enough time to regain her composure. When caught in emotional blackmail, victims often feel a strong sense of urgency, believing they must respond to the blackmailer's demands within a specific time frame. This internal pressure can be overwhelming. In such moments, the victim's priority should be to buy time for self-reflection. For example, the wife in the story can respond to her husband with statements like, "I can't give you an answer right now, let me think about it," or, "Resigning is a significant decision, and it impacts our family income. I need some time to consider it." She can also opt to change her environment temporarily for a calm reflection, saying something like, "I need a moment to collect my thoughts, I'm going to grab a glass of water or use the restroom. I'll be right back." Changing the environment can help her regain her composure. After securing some time, the victim should proceed to the second step, observe. In this phase, the victim should assume the role of an observer. She should assess the blackmailer's demands. What do they want? How are they making their demands? Is their tone loving or filled with threats? And what would be the blackmailer's reaction if she doesn't comply? Furthermore, she should also observe her own thoughts and feelings regarding the demands. What are her feelings? Which specific words or actions of the blackmailer trigger discomfort, leading her to compromise or give in? For instance, if the wife feels compelled to compromise because she believes her husband's feelings are more important, this belief generates guilt, making her think she should not insist on her own desires. Moreover, when the husband displays anger or shouts, it triggers intense negative emotions in her, leading to compromises to alleviate these feelings. While observing her emotional responses, the victim can also pay attention to her physiological reactions, such as blushing, a tense back, or a queasy stomach. The body often manifests genuine emotional reactions. As discussed earlier, victims often fall into emotional blackmail due to hidden emotional buttons. Therefore, to break free from blackmail, it's crucial to understand one's emotional responses and the beliefs that trigger them. This helps maintain objectivity and avoid automatic response patterns. Lastly, once the victim has observed the blackmailer and themselves, they can move on to the third step, strategy. For less important demands, the victim can consciously make concessions or agree with conditions. However, for requests that violate their principles, standards, or cause harm to themselves or others, the victim should firmly decline. Dealing with emotional blackmail is often challenging because the blackmailer is usually someone close, well acquainted with the victim. To resist emotional blackmail effectively, one must employ strategies and techniques while dealing with the blackmailer. The book primarily discusses 4 strategies. The first strategy is called non-defensive communication. When faced with emotional blackmail, victims often develop a defensive mentality. In an attempt to shield themselves from the triggered feelings of fear, responsibility, and guilt, they might react vigorously. However, such defensive responses often worsen the situation. For instance, a mother may use a guilt-inducing approach to make her child comply. If the child reacts strongly, saying something like, "Do you realize how ridiculous your demands are? Can't you be less selfish?" the victim's resistance can escalate the blackmailer's emotional instability, adding to the victim's psychological stress. Non-defensive communication takes a different approach. By altering their language, we can reduce the hostility within the blackmailer, making communication smoother. If the blackmailer aggressively initiates an argument or resorts to threats, it's crucial not to engage in a fight but to stay composed. Moreover, don't change your stance based on the blackmailer's attitude. Instead, focus on your goal and work on diffusing the tension. For example, choose a quiet setting to sit down with the blackmailer and have a conversation. Listen to what they have to say. After they finish speaking, don't rush to rebut them. Instead, acknowledge the blackmailer first. Say something like, "You make a valid point." Seize the moment when the blackmailer is in a better mood to express your own thoughts. When the blackmailer relaxes, the subsequent conversation will flow much more smoothly. The second strategy for dealing with the blackmailer is turning an enemy into an ally. Instead of standing in opposition to the blackmailer, try to bring them into your camp. Transform the issues presented by the blackmailer into problems both of you need to solve together. For example, a desperate wife can say, "You work hard to provide for the family, and I appreciate that. With the addition of our child, our expenses have increased significantly. I don't want to be a stay-at-home mom. It's putting too much financial burden on our family. However, I also want to take care of our child. Honey, you're smart and resourceful. Can we brainstorm together and find an alternative to me quitting my job? I'm not opposing you but suggesting that we work together as a team to solve this issue." By shifting the blackmailer's attention to problem solving, the focal point of the conflict is subtly moved. The third strategy for dealing with the blackmailer is a conditional exchange. In emotional blackmail, it's often the victim who makes concessions. However, conditional exchange addresses this imbalance. It makes both parties understand that there's no gain without giving. If you want the other person to change, you must be willing to change to some extent. For instance, if a wife consistently uses threats of leaving to compel her husband to compromise, the husband can start by meeting some of her conditions. For example, spending more time with her on weekends or helping out more with household chores during weekdays. However, the husband should also express his own expectations. During conflicts, they should agree to resolve issues calmly rather than resorting to the threat of leaving. Conditional exchange is an excellent way to break deadlocks, allowing both parties to compromise without feeling disadvantaged. The fourth strategy for dealing with the blackmailer is to use humor. Humor acts as a lubricant in intimate relationships and eases communication between people. When you sense emotional blackmail from the other person and want to express your dissatisfaction without creating intense tension, you can use humor. For instance, when the other person presents demands you're unwilling to accept, you can jokingly say, "To prove my sincerity, how about I start dancing for you?" Light-hearted humor during communication can diffuse the other person's anger and create a relaxed atmosphere for further conversation. The above methods are quick strategies, teaching you how to respond behaviorally to emotional blackmail. However, to fundamentally break free from emotional blackmail, victims must sever their emotional triggers at a psychological level. Let's begin by discussing how to address the fear in your life. Victims of emotional blackmail fear being abandoned, rejected, or losing affection. The author believes this fear arises from a lack of self-worth and self-trust, leading to the fear of not being recognized by others and the fear of abandonment. To address this fear, you need to rebuild your self-confidence. Here, we introduce 2 exercises. The first is, reacquainting yourself. You can list your strengths and positive qualities and frequently praise yourself. When you discover that you're not as fragile or useless as you might imagine, you'll find the strength to resist emotional blackmail. The second method is, reenacting scenarios. If you've recently succumbed due to fear, you can use your imagination to replay the situation. This time, however, don't yield but envision things unfolding according to your desires. For example, you can boldly express your demands and imagine the other person's anger. During this process, keep repeating your viewpoint until you persuade the imagined version of the other person. Through this method, you'll realize that expressing your inner thoughts isn't as challenging as you might have thought. Moving on, let's discuss how to deal with feelings of responsibility and guilt. These emotions often stem from faulty beliefs. People aren't inherently burdened by a sense of responsibility, it's something learned from parents, school, and society. Much of our upbringing emphasizes sacrifice as a virtue. Consequently, many individuals feel that others' needs are more important than their own. When they can't meet others' demands, they experience intense guilt, often for things they haven't done wrong. To address these feelings of responsibility and guilt, victims must reconstruct their cognitive framework. Start by examining your beliefs. Which ones are the expectations others have of you? Then, reevaluate whether these are truly accurate. Are others' evaluations of you factual, or are they just subjective opinions? For instance, when someone says, "You're so selfish," don't immediately accept this viewpoint. Instead, learn to ask questions like, "Am I genuinely selfish, or is this just one person's perspective?" The next step is to change your beliefs. The first method involves changing sentence structures. If you believe you should sacrifice everything for your family, transform this affirmative statement into a question: why should my family's needs be more important than my own? Is this thought genuinely reasonable? Although this method is simple, as you implement it, you'll gradually notice changes in your previous thought patterns. The second method is creating an emotion box. Write down your negative feelings each day or the negative evaluations you receive from others on pieces of paper. Put these notes in a box, then dispose of it, whether by throwing it away or burning it. Through this process, you signal to yourself to stop accepting negative evaluations that you don't need to bear. The third method is paradoxical therapy. Essentially, you exaggerate your negative feelings to an absurd degree, making yourself appear ridiculous. The author provides an example. A girl felt guilty for initiating a breakup with her boyfriend. The author encouraged her to imagine herself standing in front of her boyfriend, saying, "I know I can't live without you. I'll never leave you. I'm willing to give up all my dreams for you." By using this method, the girl realized that her guilt was entirely unnecessary. To summarize the book's 3 key points. 1. Emotional blackmail is a powerful manipulation tactic. Blackmailers use threats to pressure victims into compliance, rather than presenting conditions for free choice. 2. Emotional blackmail occurs due to a collaboration between the blackmailer and the victim. Blackmailers can't tolerate setbacks, and even minor ones trigger deep-seated fears of loss. To alleviate their anxiety, they turn to pressuring the victim, who, due to emotional triggers, experiences intense suffering and loses their ability to make sound judgments, ultimately giving in. 3. When facing emotional blackmail, victims can initially employ the SOS strategy to change their automatic response patterns. However, they must also change their inner world to sever emotional triggers' control. Emotional blackmail itself isn't the frightening aspect. What's more concerning is when we know we're caught in it but are unwilling to make changes, even at the cost of sacrificing ourselves to please others. As the author says, only by bravely confronting and making changes can we end this manipulation game disguised as love. That concludes the interpretation of this book. Congratulations, you've completed another book. Thank you for tuning in to the Tim Booker channel. Please subscribe to the Tim Booker channel, like, and share this valuable knowledge with your friends. Let's combine wisdom with practicality to achieve our financial goals and create a better future. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.